Thank you everyone for joining our webinar today, the first of the DPA's webinars for 2024. And today we're going to be talking about the digital switchover, and that's the move that is currently happening. This is getting people from traditional landlines to all calls being made essentially over the internet, with the copper network being turned off next year. So we've got a great panel here today who are going to talk about some of the concerns, but also some of the efforts by industry to deal with the problems that some people are facing. So if you've not been to a DPA event before, my name is Elizabeth Anderson, and I'm the Chief Executive at the Digital Poverty Alliance. And the DPA exists to ensure that we end digital poverty once and for all within the UK by 2030. So this is all about affordability, connectivity, skills, trust and confidence to get online, but to also use all types of digital services. I'm going to ask our panelists to just really briefly introduce themselves. So we've got Dennis Reed, Kamran Mallick, and Sarah Shepherd. Dennis, would you like to kick off?
Yes, thanks, Elizabeth. I'm Dennis Reed. I'm director of the only UK-wide campaign organisation for the over 60s. We campaign on all older people's issues. And I think it's fair to say that we've been the leading critic, if you like, of this transformation and change from traditional landlines to internet-based systems. So yes, I look forward to talking further about the whole issue.
Thanks, Dennis, and thanks, Elizabeth. My name's Kamran Mallick. I'm Chief Exec of Disability Rights UK. We're a disabled people's organisation UK-wide, and our primary goal is around ensuring that our societies are inclusive, and as changes happen, that disabled people don't get left behind. So I'm really interested in this topic and this conversation because it affects all disabled people up and down the country.
And Sarah.
Hi, I'm Sarah Shepherd. I work within techUK, which is the UK's tech trade association, the largest one there. I work exclusively on the digital landline switchover, so I work on behalf of the larger communication providers and network providers to coordinate their action and work to increase awareness of this to industry sectors. And I coordinate with government, with the regulators, and with different industry sectors on troubleshooting problems and looking to see how we can help solve some of the issues coming up. Great to be here.
Fantastic. Thank you all for joining. I think this is going to be a really, really interesting session. Good to see people already doing this. Please do use the chat to say who you are, what organisation you're representing, whereabouts in the country you are. I am in really quite cold Kent. We'd also love to hear your questions. So at the bottom of the screen, there's a Q&A button. Do press that, pop your questions in there. And then if we've got time towards the end, we would love to get to some of those. Unusually for one of our webinars, I'm just going to give some key definitions before we get going, because there's going to be some terms flying around that some people will be really familiar with and other people, including myself until recently, may have never heard. So we're going to be talking about the PSTN, which is the Public Switched Telephone Network. That's what's being turned off. This can also be referred to as the copper wire network. It's the landline network we've used in this country since 1875. Simple phones that don't plug into the electricity supply are powered over that. People are moving to VoIP, VoIP, Voice over Internet Protocol. Basically, that runs calls off the internet rather than copper wires. You might also have heard that being called digital voice, which is the name BT use. Not every provider uses that name. We may also touch on downstream service providers. That's companies who make things like telecare alarms, burglar alarms, or any device that might use landline services. Telecare being a device in the home that alerts a call centre if there's a problem, like a fall or a home intruder, to send for help. And a lifeline is a common term for a type of telecare often used by older people or those with health conditions that again uses landline services to alert a call centre to arrange for help. And why is all of this happening? So globally, we do know copper networks are becoming less profitable. not only are people making fewer landline calls these days, but for businesses and offices, there's huge savings by coming off that copper network and paying for those individual lines. And staff then can also work at home and make calls from those same numbers, which is why it became so popular in larger organisations. But for those of us at home, in turn, this has led to lesser investment in copper networks, a shortage of parts, and around the world, there's a target of 2030 to move off copper. However, in the UK, the telco industry has set a more ambitious target of 2025, so that is next year. Dennis, you were on the advisory group for BT's Digital Voice programme. Could you tell us a little bit more about the context of what we're talking about today?
Yes, the agreement that was reached between the government and the telecom industry, I believe, was around 2017, as far as this timetable was concerned. But I think it's fair to say there was not that much initial publicity around it at all, and not very much happening for quite a long time. And then, of course, the pandemic intervened. So it wasn't until the end of 2021, early 2022, that we became aware of some concerns of our members about the fact that digital voice was coming. I'm using the BT term here. Digital voice was coming, and they would possibly have difficulties, which we'll get onto later, about making emergency calls or telecare alarm systems and so on. So we started raising the issue in the press in 2022, and in April 2022, BT responded to those concerns by pausing their whole rollout. They set up what they called the Digital Voice Advisory Group, and we were invited to be on it together with other charities and a number of BT insiders to develop policies to support vulnerable customers as far as this switchover was concerned. We reached an agreement, I thought, in March 2023, and BT then restarted its mass rollout, and obviously other telecom companies have been doing the same since then. But it quickly became clear to us that although there was a good agreement in principle in writing, it wasn't actually translating to what was happening at local level. So, for example, the agreement said that anybody over 70 would not be transferred for at least a year, so that some of the new products and technology could be introduced, and issues around the telecare systems could also be sorted out. Also, it was said that those that have poor mobile signals would not be transferred over. Also, people obviously on telecare systems themselves would not be transferred over. But what started happening was that we started getting a number of complaints from our members that this agreement was being ignored. And indeed, BT unilaterally then raised the upper age limit to 75, they said, without sort of consulting us about it. So we were concerned that this agreement, so-called, was something of a smokescreen. And what was happening was that people were not being told when they were transferring over that there were these possible exemptions. So people were simply getting letters saying, we're transferring you over to the new system. If you have any questions, contact us. Now, that is not the same as saying, if you are a vulnerable customer by whatever means, that you would not have to transfer over. So, you know, we were very concerned about this. We withdrew from the Digital Voice Advisory Group, and we've been campaigning since then against what we see as a rushed timetable. Just briefly, just to say what the timetable is, because I'm sure that people around who are listening will want to know this. This is BT's timetable. The rollout is already taking place in East Midlands, Yorkshire and Humberside and Northern Ireland. It started in the Northwest and London. In the spring of 2024, it's due to come to the West Midlands, the South East, Wales and East Anglia. And in the summer of 2024, this year, it's due in the North East, Scotland and the South West. So it's really, there's really momentum behind this, which is a great concern. Yes, we don't think that a lot of the issues have been sorted through, and we'll come on to those later on. And we think that the timetable should be extended by at least 5 years, so that these issues can be sorted out and the two systems can work in parallel. And if that's what's happening internationally, then it should also be happening here in the UK.
Thank you, Dennis. That's a really sort of helpful overview, I think, for people in terms of, you know, what some of the concerns are. And of course, there's real experiences now for customers who are becoming perhaps more vulnerable through these kinds of changes, including those who are living with disabilities. I mean, Kamran, would you like to talk through some of the work you're doing?
Thanks, Elizabeth. So I think our concern as an organization is always ensuring that disabled people's kind of needs are understood by the organizations, companies, industries that are making the shift. And what we tend to find is that disabled people aren't often informed. So it's fine to, you may write to a customer and say, this is happening and we're going to switch you over. If you have any concerns, get in touch with us. Well, the thing is, people don't know if they should have a concern because they actually don't know what the pros and cons of this new switchover are, because of course, every time anything new happens, it's always sold as the next best thing, without taking into account, well, actually, what are the pros and cons and what's going to be different and what are you going to have to do in order for this to work? And in terms of people, our concern of people just being switched over, I was switched over. I am a BT customer. I've got broadband, I've got the landline, and I've got a number of mobile phones with BT and EE now. And once a year I ring them up and I say my contract's coming to an end. I like to talk about how much I'm being charged. And last time that happened, I was told, oh, well, you can have your landline, so you don't have to pay for it anymore. It can be on a pay-as-you-go system, because I don't really use my landline. And I, of course, accepted that. I thought that's a good thing. And before I knew it, I received a new BT hub with instructions to now plug my phone into that because I'd been switched over. I didn't have the conversation about, did I want to switch over? Was now the right time? Did I have to do it now? And there certainly wasn't any conversation with me about what my requirements might be and how is BT or others identifying who those customers are that may be left vulnerable as part of the switchover. I don't actually know how that's happening. People often won't be proactive in ringing up a company and saying, oh, by the way, I'm a disabled person, because why would you? So it's incumbent upon the industry and the companies to be asking questions in a particular way, so people understand why they're being asked into information and what the company's going to do about it.
Thank you, Cameron. I think that's really helpful to sort of hear. And Dennis, you've sort of started to touch on some of this, but what do you think are the common problems that customers are encountering now with that switchover, and why is it important that those don't continue to occur?
Yeah, just to echo what Cameron said, the thing is that telecom companies don't have comprehensive lists of those who might be vulnerable to the new system. So unless they actually say to the customer, if you are in these categories, contact us and we'll talk to you about it, then there's no way of knowing. And what happens is that people are switched over. So with the best will in the world, I don't know of any of our people who have got vulnerabilities in relation to this switchover, who've been contacted by the telecom company to say, we understand that you have a telecare system. We need to talk to you about that system and how it's compatible to the new arrangements. I don't know of anybody that's actually had that. And what happens, in fact, is just as Cameron said, there's a letter comes which says you're going to be switched over. You will get a router in the post. There will be instructions about how to set up the router if you know how to do that. And that's what actually happens. And we've had cases of people with dementia who've received a router through the post that has obviously been not on any list of the telecom company as a particularly vulnerable person. And then the landline has been switched off. We've had cases of people who've come back from holiday to find that their landline has been switched off, and there's a router with a neighbour or outside the door or whatever. There's numerous examples of these sorts of things happening. The Daily Mail actually had a huge list of people with problems with this switchover, which was covered only a few weeks ago. So the sorts of issues that we face are obviously personal alarm systems called telecare. Some of those systems don't actually work with the new digital arrangements. The telecom companies say that they're getting lists from local authorities and so on. Well, that's fine, but there's a lot of privately purchased personal alarm systems out there, which the telecom companies have no idea about where those are. There's the whole issue of reliability of the new system. As we all know, the internet does tend to go down from time to time, and in a power cut, there will be no internet. Therefore, there's no ability to make an emergency call, which you can at the moment, usually through the copper line traditional landline. So anybody that is susceptible to falls, who is getting older and is in ill health, may have a heart attack or a stroke, there's great worries that they don't have the reliability of the landline system there with this new system. It's not as if the internet is infallible in terms of always being there. And that is one of the big issues that older people in particular are facing. There's also concerns about costs, because quite often new phones are required. The telecom companies will provide in certain circumstances free phones, but if you have phones on different levels of your house because of inability to get around the house, you often have to pay for an extra handset. The telecom companies say that they will provide battery backups in case there is a power cut, but these only last about an hour, usually up to an hour, and they have to be charged in order to sort of step in when the power goes down. And also, telecom companies are charging £85 for these, so it is an extra cost involved. And obviously, a lot of people, especially some of our older members, are not clued up about what to do with routers, and they need engineer visits to actually help them set things up. So all these things, are not yet resolved, and yet there is a mass mobilization of the telecom companies to get this done by the end of 2025, and it is, very problematical from our members concerned. Millions of people still don't know that they're going to be switched over. So there's going to be all sorts of hullabaloo as this mass migration takes place. And that's why we're calling for an extended timetable. Just one other point, and I had an interesting call from one of our members who happens to be in New Zealand. And they've had sort of big crises recently with earthquakes and floods and so on. And in those circumstances, the mobile networks themselves actually went down. And therefore, people without landlines had no form of communication whatsoever. So it's all very well for the telecom companies to say, well, you can always use a mobile phone as a backup in the event of a power cut. But, if the cellular system goes down, then that is also taken out of the equation. And of course, there's all those thousands and thousands of people, particularly in rural areas, who have a very poor or non-existent mobile signal. So that can't be relied on as a backup. I think that's probably enough, Elizabeth, in terms of the common problems faced. But there are a lot of them, and they're not being resolved by the telecom companies. And that's why we're taking this position.
Elizabeth, can I just add that just to be mindful that we are going through a cost of living crisis. We have data from organizations like the Trussell Trust and Joseph Rowntree that show that over 60% of households that live in poverty have a disabled person in their household. And if the switchover is going to add cost burdens to people, that's unfair. I believe, and I would be asking to say, well, the industry should be picking up those costs. because switchover is being forced upon people.
Thank you both for that. And actually, we're going to pick up on Dennis's point around mobile access later on, but I'd love to bring Sarah in at this point, who I'm sure probably has a lot that she'd like to say back to some of Dennis's and Cameron's points. Something also that I'd love you to pick up on, Sarah, is we haven't seen a sort of widespread communication campaign. Often people reference the digital television switchover that happened in 2012. And we know that different people are hearing at different times. So if they're in different regions, if they're not with BT, they wouldn't have heard anything yet, even if they are in one of those regions. But all of this is going to happen by next year. Do you think that would help? Why has that not happened?
Hi, thank you. So I've been typing in the chat as well to kind of answer some of the questions. I'll kind of start a little bit back. Just to clarify, this isn't actually a copper switch off. This is the copper switch off will follow on. This is like a necessary precursor to it, but the digital landline will and can and will run over copper networks. I suppose that was the first point I wanted to make. There's always a bit of confusion and nobody wants to get too technical. The announcement that this network was going to be retired was made back in 2017. And Dennis, you're quite right. There wasn't a lot of noise about that after that. It was just kind of announced. And then the communication providers, the larger ones, were out there kind of reaching out, trying to work with the telecare sector, trying to work with government, seeing that it is quite a large switchover. It's going to affect many different aspects, not just, we're not taking away landlines. It's just the technology that's behind those landlines is going to be replaced and upgraded. And the reason for that announcement is partly because the government wants to move to full fibre and gigabit connectivity across the UK, but also because this network is over 40 years old and it is a precarious network. This is happening around the world, and it's not 2030 around the world. I mean, some countries have already done it. Germany, Estonia, the Netherlands, they've ploughed on with it. Japan, I believe, is already switched off. But all the countries are going through this change. And the reason for it is the network is end of life. The parts aren't being manufactured, the service agreements aren't in place. And Ofcom, just before Christmas, they published their Connected Nations report, which gathers the data across the UK and says this is the state of play. And one thing that was picked up on that report is that the PSTN is increasingly precarious. There is an increase in network faults, an increase in network performance issues, and we're now seeing a 20% rise, that we saw last year, 20% rise in the number of PSTN incidents, which led to a 60% increase in those service hours lost. So the status quo isn't something that we can maintain even if we wanted to. And I think as we get closer and closer to the end of 2025, we're going to see those incidents rising. And that's with fewer people using the PSTN. Is now more than half the country. I think it's like 60% of the country is no longer using the PSTN for their landline. So we're already moving that way in a voluntary way. All that kind of being said, to set the scene on why this program is going on. The managed migration program, or the forced migration, or those that are kind of going on that regional basis, that's happening at the moment with BT Consumer and with Virgin Media O2. So different networks, different approaches. And they are very carefully, and you may have seen the news coverage over Christmas where the government kind of stepped in and said, actually, there are some vulnerable customers that are slipping through the cracks. What more can be done? So the signatories of that charter said, we can commit to doing this to protect the vulnerable. Before we do this managed migration process, we'll put even more checks and balances in place. And that was in reflection of the fact that we don't want anybody to have a bad experience through this necessary journey. But also, as communication providers, they're only as good as the data that they have. To go, I suppose, to your point, Dennis, about how do they know who's using the telecare device, that is a different contract. That's a different providing company that's just kind of piggybacked onto the landline. But what the communication providers are doing is they're checking their call records. They're looking to see, are there calls going out to alarm receiving centres that would indicate that there is a telecare device on there? There's data sharing agreements in place with local authorities because they do, for the most part, have the bulk of that information. I try to get all this information so there can be a better process in place to manage the migration of those vulnerable. So it could be an engineer doing the installation to come through and just to check that everything was in. But as a telecom sector, we need to be working with so many different partners to make this journey work. So we need to be working with local authorities. We need the telecare sector to come in and check that their kit is actually digitally and IP enabled, so it will continue to work. And there's a lot of kind of those balancing acts to get right. on that. And it's great to see that the government has become more involved in that, and to see, that they'll be looking to see what they can do to bring this together. I suppose going to the national campaign, it is a question that I've been working on this probably since 2018. And one of the things that we did was we commissioned a study looking at international experiences and seeing what we could learn from other countries. And one of the first things we did was we brought in somebody from Alex Pumphrey from the Digital TV Switchover to talk through how they approached the campaign across the UK to see if there was something we could perhaps learn from that. And there is this similarity, that she said, you look at the end customer perspective and then you work back from that. And that's kind of like, that's how we're looking at it. They had a £600 million budget that was given to them by the government because the government then sold off the spectrum and got even more money back in from that. There isn't that budget here, and there isn't government leading it in the same way because they see it clearly as an industry-led decision. And whilst it is industry set, it's industry depending on many other industries and many other parties to get it right. So a national TV campaign to reach the people it really needs to reach is probably it's not the easiest message to get over because communication providers are doing it in their own time frame and in their own way. So you might have regional rollouts. You might have some countries that use completely different products that aren't yet affected by the end of 2025 deadline. They'll be moving to digital lines ahead of the copper switch off, but that's not quite on the same time scale. And you'd also need to be reaching telUK users, vulnerable and all of that. So I think the way that BT has approached it and the way that Virgin Media, when they go in and they kind of target that area, I think that's something that's got a lot of feet because BT is going in there to the local community, setting up coffee shops, going out, speaking to not just their customers, but anybody that's kind of interested in it will come along and learn more about it. And I think one of the other things that we could take away from that digital TV switchover, so I've been talking a long time, it's my last point, was the importance, they said, of working with grassroots organisations, the third sector, the charities, and making sure that that right message is going through to not just that final end customer, but the charities and the sectors that are supporting them. So we're speaking to the friends and family, we're educating, and we're helping understand like what those concerns are. I don't think the solution is extending the deadline because we're going to see that those faults are going to go up and up. And I think it wouldn't be a great scenario to have the most vulnerable cohort members of society left on this precarious and unstable network. But what we do want to do is safely transition them over, kind of hand-holding and doing what we can to work with different organisations to get the right message out there without the fear-mongering. So.
Thank you for that, Sarah. And actually just sort of picking up on what you've said there, because actually it's also coming up in the chat. So absolutely, Ofcom have long required providers, and actually the recent charter reiterates the need to identify at-risk customers, have those effective comms in place, extra protection measures to make sure anyone eligible is protected through that process. What are the telco companies, not just BT, but the sort of the industry more widely, doing to identify those people who are made vulnerable through this change, above and beyond sort of purely those who are registered with local authorities for social care? How far along are they in that process? What will those extra protections look like for once those people are found?
So there is no industry-wide definition of vulnerable in the telecom sector, and that is something that I think that we'll be working on as part of that charter to be like, well, what could that look like? And there will also be aspects of this program in particular and the products being put out there that will make a customer fall within that vulnerable definition. So, for example, Ofcom, when they set their expectations on the maintaining access to emergency services, they included within that anybody that is landline reliant. And they could be landline reliant either because they live in an area of poor mobile phone coverage or because they don't want to use a mobile phone. They don't have one and they don't want one. That would make them landline reliant, or they use their landline more than the average customer, and that might be to call doctor surgeries or something. So they would fall within that scope of vulnerable, as well as a telecare user would in this context make them vulnerable. And that goes beyond, I suppose, the additional flags in a communication provider systems where you might be vulnerable for any of the reasons that Ofcom has kind of produced their guidance on, or their outlines that would make them vulnerable. But I think it is kind of extending that and seeing actually there's a lot of data out there. Can it be used better? can data be shared better from local authorities so that we can understand actually local authorities, they're the ones who know who are being provided with telecare equipment. Can that information get to CPs? How can that get there? Can we not force the well, I suppose force the sharing? We need to know who it is that has that telecare so that we can then put in place a special process to manage that migration over, and working with the different parts, so the telecare providers and suppliers, with the local authorities, with the service providers, and saying, okay, these customers are going to be migrated. We need to make sure that it's done safely. Yeah.
That's really helpful, Sarah. Thank you. Sort of moving on to the mobile piece. We know that industry figures suggest that only, I'm going to sort of slightly emphasize that, 1% of people can't access any mobile signal, particularly for making a 999 call. Now, just to sort of cover that, and that is specifically that even if you're on, for the sake of argument, a Vodafone network and there's an O2 signal in the area that you're in, you'll always be able to call 999 because you can access that regardless of the network that you're on. But that deal doesn't sort of apply for other numbers you might want to reach in an emergency, like UK power networks. Why, Cameron, for example, might you see that as a problem, given that it is a relatively small group of people? But of course, we can overlay against that the upcoming sunsetting of the 3G network across the UK. Cameron, you're on mute.
That better? Yeah. Can you hear me now? Yeah. I think some of the points have already been mentioned in terms of, so we know of people who have got cognitive impairments, conditions like Parkinson's and other conditions like that, who may well have a mobile phone, but actually they've always relied on having a landline, and that's actually their go-to device. And just because of the nature of people's certain health conditions, they will often not think to keep their mobile phone charged up, switched on, available at the time when you actually need it in an emergency. The reliance is on the landline. So that's kind of the first thing, is you've always had that phone that sits somewhere that you had for however many years. So that's where you would normally go, and people expect both kind of medical calls to come through on the landline, as well as making emergency calls, particularly in a case of a power cut or a flooding situation that we've seen more recently. But in addition to that, many people will have older phones that they've just not upgraded. So kind of the non-smartphones, they're called feature phones, aren't they? The kind of feature phones that they've just not upgraded because to them, they're not interested in the additional expense of buying a smartphone. I've got an old phone that just works, and that's what they've got. So there's that added expense of now having to purchase a different phone with the 3G system coming off as well, and making sure that it's 4G compliant. And then, as well as I mentioned the point earlier about the poverty and the number of disabled people and families who have a disabled person in their family living within what's defined as living in poverty. And then we have the cost of living crisis at the moment as well. So the additional cost burdens that particularly disabled people and people with long-term health conditions already have. And there is well-established data about the extra cost of disability. That was the charity Scope does a regular kind of assessment of what living as a disabled person costs. It used to be about £500. It's now gone up to almost £900 a month extra cost on a dish. So this is just adding to that additional cost element for someone.
Thank you for that. I think it's incredibly important that we actually really start to take into account the behavioural change that will be required for people to ensure that they keep mobiles charged up, for them to ensure that they keep battery backups charged up, and indeed the sort of affordability and changes that changes of equipment that people will need to make sure they've thought about before these changes hit their particular household. A sort of a question to you all, so do jump in with a relatively short answer would be fantastic. as well as the landline providers, there's a number of other organisations who are being blamed around the problems with the switch. Local authorities, downstream service providers. Whose overarching responsibility do you each think it is to make sure that those problems don't continue to occur? Because I think we can all agree that we want people to have that universal access and not to be facing some of the problems they're seeing at the moment. Who'd like to kick us off? Go for it.
Yeah, just very briefly to come back on the mobile question. I mean, the 1% is of the people who have no mobile signal at all, and I'm worried about the millions of people who have patchy or weak signals, who have to go to a particular room in the house to get a call or get a call through. If somebody's fallen downstairs and the only place they can get mobile reception is in their attic, they're not going to be able to reach it, are they? So, you know, that is a big issue, and there's a lot more than 1% in that category. In terms of responsibility, the government and the telecom companies agreed this timetable. It is their joint responsibility to deal with this. The telecom companies are giants. They make huge profits, and for commercial reasons, they're rushing this timetable, and I believe that they're exaggerating the decrepitness or otherwise of the existing traditional landline system in order to rush through this for commercial reasons. And I think the government now needs to sit down again with the telecom companies to reflect on where you are with this whole program, look at the unresolved issues and decide how to take it forward. It's no good just saying, oh, well, we're still developing these things, or we're still getting this information from local authorities. People are being transferred over now. That's the issue. They haven't resolved the problem. So what we want to see is, and Michelle Donnellan has already started doing this, which is welcome, just before Christmas, to talk to people in the telecom industry about vulnerable customers. We need a bigger, wider discussion to review the whole program and the timetable. That's what we need, and it's their joint responsibility, government and the telecom industry. They're trying to blame local authorities, they're trying to blame telecare companies, but that's not right. It's their responsibility.
I would just back what Dennis has said. I mean, I'm really clear. Government exists to protect and serve its communities, its citizens. And can't wash its hands of something and just say, well, this is an industry-led thing, they can get on with it. They have to set the standard, the framework, the requirements, the checks and balances that should be in place. The regulator has a role to play in this as well, to ensure that people don't suffer as a result, don't become vulnerable as a result of the switchover. And the telecom giants, as Dennis has said, these are profit-making entities. They generate huge amounts of money and profit. To then not to tackle some of these issues before rolling out. And so when Sarah was talking about some of the issues that are still being worked out around telecare and who should have the information, my thing will be is, well, that should be done before you start to roll out. You should have done that bit and then start the rollout, because you know you're going to need this information to start something, and then part way start to say, well, we still need to work these things out. We're in January 2024, and we're saying by January 25, this will all have been done. I'm not so confident on that.
Sarah, on behalf of the telecom giants, but
I mean, I suppose you're right. We're in January 2024. This was announced in November 2017, and that's given a lot of industries a lot of time to prepare. So I suppose the argument be is, if you extend this, is anything different going to happen? Are they going to actually prepare, or are they just going to think, okay, we can hold hostage the telecoms companies on this migration? I think going back to the point about whose responsibility is it, the telecoms industry is strictly regulated. Ofcom is, and I have a background in European telecoms, I would say one of the stricter regulators out there. There's a lot of requirements imposed by Ofcom that just don't exist in other countries, including that maintaining the access to emergency services obligation. So telecoms companies are working under those strict regulations set by Ofcom, and the expectations of government on this. It's not that this technology change will result in a different obligation on them. It will maintain the same obligations. And it does become difficult when you look at whose responsibility is it for services that clever engineers back in the 80s kind of set up running over what should have been a telephone line. But they were like, well, this is a powered network. What can we put on here? And they set up a whole heap of things without the knowledge of the telecoms company. And they've just steadily worked, very luckily, and using the electricity paid for by the telecoms company for decades. But the point is now that actually that is going to be retired. So the responsibility for those companies that are providing a service of their product to customers, they do need to take ownership of that, of the fact that this is a service that they're providing, and they need to be moving it to make sure that it is, set and it's fit to provide in 2 years' time or now at the moment, because they have actually had many years to prepare for this. Given that the telecom sector don't actually have any power over companies using that line and selling different products and services, there is a role for government, I think, to step up here and be like, actually, there needs to be more onus on other sectors to match kind of that strict regulatory environment that the telecoms operators are working in. Telecare sector is completely unregulated, and I find that absolutely insanity that you can have this critical end of life provision of service but not regulated by it. I don't understand how that is possible, and I think Michelle Donlan has spoken to counterparts in the Department for Health and Social Care and Department for Levelling Up Housing and Communities, and it's like, well, what can those different government bodies, government departments look at doing to make sure that actually we're all working on this together so that it becomes a shared responsibility?
I'll mute myself there. Thank you very much for that, Sarah. And I'm going to start moving over to some of the Q&A that we've had, but it's really great actually to have some debate going on both here within the panelists and indeed on the chat. And it's good to see also that we've got some of the telecoms companies along today. So hopefully hearing some of the concerns, but also reflecting back some of the work that they're doing. So one of our first questions is, are the telephone companies working with each other to share best practice and communicate about timetables, etc., in the different regions? And if so, how is that looking? Sarah, that's probably a good one to come to you on.
Yes, they are. They're working through the role set up within techUK, where I spend every day, all of my days working on this and bringing together the communication providers with the different industry stakeholders or government departments to raise awareness on that. As part of what we do, and there was an event, a briefing that we organised back in November, I'm trying to get my years right now, 2022, where we invited all the local authorities in to help them prepare and understand what was going on. And as part of that, we've been working with combined authorities and local authorities on actually, this is what's happening, this is what it means. We've held business briefings where we brought in, there was another question actually about other countries. We had somebody from Gamma, a provider in another provider, who brought over one of their counterparts who ran the switchover in Germany to talk about actually their experience in Germany and what that meant. So that was focused on the business community, but a lot of it's applicable for the public sector as well. And to just kind of think, okay, so this is what we know, this is what we can work with, and this is how we can share best practice. So working with local authorities, working with businesses, working with different industry sectors. We're also in the process of producing some leaflets and information sheets, which will go to either members of Parliament, where we held a parliamentary briefing in October last year to help them understand what was going on and why, and how to respond to any constituency concerns. But we'll also be preparing this for telecare users, local authorities, and all of that will then be hosted on a website. Aware that the website isn't always helpful if you don't have the internet, but it's the PDF, the printable, and it's just another resource out there.
Fantastic. And I think sort of be interested to hear from Dennis around this, because it's sort of picking up on some of the concerns we've had, but Sarah, Cameron, you may want to come in as well. So one of the big concerns, of course, is around what to do when there's a power cut, because when there's been a power cut in the past, you've easily been able to pick up your landline. Dennis, are you sort of seeing some of that advice being made available or not?
Well, no, not really, no. There is a lack of communication about this whole program, and I'm not aware that the telecom companies are when they send their routers, that they're sending out detailed information about what to do if you need to make an emergency call. I'm not aware of that, and I would put something to Sarah here, because the communication is the issue, I think. And if you take the telecom companies at their word, why are the telecom companies not, when they send a note saying there's going to be a switchover, why are they not saying, if you fall into any of these following categories, for example, you have a telecare system or you've got a disability and so on, why are they not saying, contact us and we will not force you to transfer over until you are satisfied about, your situation in an emergency? They're not doing that, and they're deliberately not doing it because they don't want too many people to contact them to say, I've got these issues or that issues. They just want to get as many people switched over as possible. And that's why they broke the agreement, which I thought they were going to do, as far as BT was concerned. I thought they were going to do this. I thought they were going to write to everybody and say, if you fall into these categories, then contact us and we won't force you to transfer over. And they're not doing that deliberately.
Well, there's only 2 companies that are actually doing this managed migration program. And BT, they've already stated that they are excluding those that they're aware of as falling under vulnerable, or those that notify them. And I've seen the information, the leaflets that have been sent out, and it does say, if you're a telecare user, to contact BT, but also to contact the provider of that service, because they're the ones that actually ultimately need to be to ensure that they provided an IP or a digital piece of kit. So that's it. I suppose it's worth drawing out the fact that you do have this managed migration, and you've got those that voluntary, like Cameron, who moved to a different package, and as part of that, he got the digital landline with it. It is also a requirement from Ofcom that you have to say, in the event of a power cut, that what will happen is essentially, if the power goes down to the premise, if the broadband goes down, you'll either fall back onto a mobile network, and it might be the same phone, it just gets a mobile backup. Or you'll need to use your mobile phone to make or receive calls, or you can be provided with a battery backup that will run for the minimum of 1 hour, but many of them do go beyond that 1 hour to keep going. And that will, I don't think any of them are sophisticated enough to actually just limit it to emergency services calls, but that is designed to allow that uninterrupted access to emergency services. And that was a requirement set by Ofcom, and I think quite a sensible one. So with that all in mind, the knowledge is out there, the awareness is out there. Ofcom has set their expectations on that, and many CPs are going above and beyond those expectations. The issue of power cuts and the length of power cuts, are some of them going on for days, I think that's something that can't actually be solved by the telecoms industry. I think we do need to look at the resilience of our energy sector and the electricity systems out there. And that is something that government is well aware of. BEIS did their report into Storm Arwen and the learnings learned there. And it's like, well, perhaps that we should be looking at the electricity sector on making sure that they are able to provide electricity system fit for the UK's needs.
Thank you both. And I'm going to put this partly to Cameron, just because you have been talking a little bit about affordability, but have you seen anything, given that there is a cost to consumers, anything around any financial support that's available around the affordability of new kit? You are on mute again.
I'm trying to be good and keep on mute. Not that I'm aware of. So I haven't seen anything that's being promoted to the country or to people, to customers, or through charities that, Disability Rights UK. We've not received anything to say, come and work with us to promote this to people about funds available for additional kit or equipment that someone might need. So I'm not aware of any of that available. The other point I would just say, Sarah, you mentioned, yes, I was migrated over, but I was done. I didn't ask for it. I was just switched over. And that was my issue, is that it was just done because it was convenient to the company, that because I was recontracting, and I'd agreed to go for this new rental-free pay-as-you-go phone line offer that I was migrated over. So I didn't actually know that's what I was doing until the kit and stuff arrived at my door. So I think, and that's the fundamental issue with the whole thing, is if I've found myself in that situation, how many others are finding themselves in that situation as well? So that's part of the worry.
I think that, again, this is a question to everyone, so do dive in if you want to answer this first, but I'm going to come to everyone on this. So we've got a question from Alessandra. Given where we are, what is reliable advice that can be given to people at this point? She's writing a piece for the borough where she is. People, many staff in local authorities, many in the voluntary and charitable and social sector don't know about this change. So what are maybe a couple of pieces of advice quickly that each of you would offer?
Shall I go?
Go for it.
Yeah, well, our advice to our members already the other week was that they should contact their telecom company now and say what their current situation is. So if they are, say, 75 with a disability, then they should contact the telecom company before the telecom company contact them to say, I'm worried about my personal safety with this transformational switchover, and I'm withholding on personal safety grounds my permission for you to switch off my landline. That's what we're actually saying to people. And if, as I can see from the chat, that there's some various BT people and telecom people are saying, we won't switch these people over, then let them know, because at the moment, they're not actually inviting you, other than a broad thing about if you have concerns, they're not inviting you, if you're in particular categories, to contact them. So we're saying to everybody, and hopefully this can be got over in the national media as well, contact the telecom companies now and say you don't want to be transferred over because of your personal safety. That's what we're saying.
Cameron, Sarah,
Yeah.
what advice would you give?
I mean, I would say similar to Dennis, but I would absolutely encourage people to contact their provider and find out what their plans are, and to find out more about when that happens, what will it mean for them, and explain how they currently rely on the system that they currently have, and whether there's anything specific about that they need to maintain. Particularly this issue about if you feel you're vulnerable in a situation where there's a power cut and you have no one else to support you and you rely on the phone to do that. The other thing I would say to the industry is to contact and get in touch with local voluntary sector organizations, local disabled people run organizations. We're fortunate in the UK that we have lots of areas in the country that have representative organizations who will often be in touch with disabled people, people with long-term health conditions, and individuals who are often described as vulnerable people. They will often know where those groups of people are.
So to finish off, I absolutely agree that you should be, or the advice to contact providers is the correct one. If you need to flag that you're vulnerable, if you're landline reliant, or just to understand more about what's going on. I mean, that's what your communication provider is there for, to talk you through basically the products and services they're selling to ensure you're happy with where you're going. And as I said earlier, communication provider is only as good as the information they hold on their customers. So a vulnerable customer who hasn't told their communication provider that actually they do need a bit more assistance in that, that'd be great if they can do that, if they can share that information with them so that they can have that special process that will be put in place. I'm not sure that withholding consent and pushing for an extension to the deadline is the best solution. It was announced many years ago, and that deadline is fast approaching, and it's in place for a reason, and it is because of the instability of the network. So really would hate to be in a situation where we see coming up to the end of 2025, the very vulnerable, those that are more reliant on the landline, still on this system. I mean, I think, a far better outcome is how we can all work together. And as Cameron says, working with the different organizations, representing those with greater need in this time. to actually make sure that we are moving them over in a safer way so that they don't feel so unaware of what's going on, and explaining exactly what it means and things like that. That's the way to go, I think. And it's that pragmatic, okay, how can we all work together, recognizing that responsibilities for doing this safely is shared across different industries and across different stakeholders, to make it a safer transition. I think that's the solution. And I don't know, I've seen a couple of questions coming up about information for local authorities. Elizabeth, very happy if you share my contact details if anybody wants to get in touch with the work that I'm doing, and always happy to have this conversation. It's all I do.
Fantastic. Thank you, everyone. We have nearly a dozen more questions. I've promised everyone we will finish this webinar on time, but we will try and possibly put some typed answers in the chat, and we will share contact details for panelists where they're happy for us to do that. In a minute, I'm just going to come to each panelist for a last thought. But just from our side, we do have some calls to action for you, and I'm very much hoping my colleagues Ellie and Adele, who are on this call, are going to help with some links to go in the chat to go alongside this. So Dennis, on behalf of Silver Voices and supported by the DPA and Disability Rights UK, has set up a petition for that call to have another 5 years, so that there is greater time to raise awareness, upskill people, and provide them with the understanding and solutions that they need, which Ellie has very kindly just pasted into that chat. So do take a look at that if you're interested. Whichever side of the debate you're on, I think we do all hopefully here agree that we want to see as many people being connected in a way that works for them, whether that's to do with phone lines, whether that is to do with internet-based digital access. So if you're interested in this debate, do visit our website, digitalpovertyalliance.org. Join our community hub, where we have discussions that relate to different aspects of digital poverty. Read our national delivery plan, which gets into quite a lot of detail around a number of different issues that relate to digital poverty. And if you like what we're doing, do click that donate link at the top of the homepage to contribute towards our work. But I'm going to finish off with a last thought from each person here. Not Kamran, because we've just lost his internet connection. So that is technology for you. Dennis, would you like to go first?
Yes, just one element really. The telecom companies don't want us to know that this is a forced transfer. Hence the comment from Sarah just now about withholding consent may not be the best approach, but we think it is the best approach, saying that we're withholding consent because of our personal safety. And woe betides any telecom company, after having had such a formal letter, then forcibly transfers somebody over to the new system without actually meeting their concerns. So that's exactly what we should be doing. And in the run-up to the general election, I can see politicians being very engaged in this process if people are being forced against their will to transfer over. So I think it's going to be an interesting year in the run-up to the general election as far as this project is concerned. And it wouldn't surprise me if the national politicians don't start getting even more involved in it.
And Sarah, the very last word from you.
I always like the last word. I suppose, putting it back into context, this is a government ambition. They want full fibre coverage everywhere. It was what Boris Johnson's election manifesto was run on. So this is the telecom's response to meeting that, is part of it. And I think, I mean, always try and end on a little bit of a positive on it. Whilst the process might seem a little bit daunting and there will be some changes, you'll still have your landline at the end of it. And this is a huge opportunity to get everybody in Britain with a broadband connection if they want one, because they're going to need one to be able to make and receive phone calls.
Thank you both very much. Thank you also to Kamran, who we thank in his absence, and a huge thanks to everyone who's been on this call today. Again, whichever side of the debate you're on, and really fantastic to see actually that debate going. This is how we raise awareness of any kind of issue. So thank you all, and do join us if you are interested in all things digital poverty again on Monday, when we will be talking to Polly Morgan of IDEA around building digital skills. Thank you all. Have a good rest of your day.